We're all about the Archers. I'm Philippa and I'm joined today by Quentin because we are here to talk. I'm so excited about this. We're here to talk to Trevor Harrison, who plays Eddie Grundy. Trevor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for having me, as they say.
It's our absolute pleasure, Trevor. Trevor, you must feel very at home in Ambridge, having been born and raised in Stourbridge in the West Midlands.
Yes, I was born in Stourbridge, and I was still living at home with my parents when I auditioned for the part of Eddie Grundy back in 1979. Since then, I moved around, but I moved back to Worcestershire, where I enjoy living, because Stourbridge was in Worcestershire when I was born, but they moved it to the West Midlands later on. But I'm back in Worcestershire now.
Do you know when you started how long-term the character of Eddie Grundy was going to be? Did they say to you, he's here to stay? Or were you just sort of playing it week by week?
No, what happened was, when I went for the audition, I was very, very nervous. I knew the character was called Eddie Grundy, and for some reason, I thought, what a brilliant name, you know. I can imagine people having T-shirts with Eddie Grundy written on. But when I went to the studio, I was nervous. I don't think I was very good. And they said, oh, while you're here, is there anything else you'd like to do for us? Well, there was a play called The Cornice Green, and the character had just to Oxford and come back, and I read that. And of course, I was so confident because I knew it backwards. You know, it was one of my favourite little play speeches. And because I did that, I went out, thanks very much. And they called me back in and said, have another go. So I had another go. I was reading with Alan Devereux, who played Sid Perks. And when we finished that second audition, Vanessa Whitburn, who was the director, said, if you get the part, would you be free for 6 months? And I thought, 6 months' work. This is brilliant. And as I say, that was a few years ago now, so I didn't know how long it was going to be, but I thought 6 months was sounded good.
Well, you've got 44 years out of it so far, Trevor.
I know, yes. I don't know.
But you said you love the name of the character Eddie Grundy. But actually, he spawned his own fan club in the 80s, didn't he? He was a fan club with the likes of John Peel as one of the founders. And he played one of your records on Radio 1.
Yeah, and it was really incredible. It's the Eddie Grundy fan club started when Eddie was sort of making his records in those days. And I remember going to Radio 1. I was invited by dear John Walters, who was John's producer, and because they were both founder members, we went down and John Walters said, John Peel would like to meet you. And he came into the studio and said, he said, may I have your autograph? He said, I've only asked for one other in my life. And he said who he was. I didn't recognise him either. So that's the kind of man he was, you know, a lovely guy. And yeah, I was honoured that he even put it in the, you know, in the who's who or whatever the big book is, you know, that people get into. Yeah. He actually proudly put, you know, as Robin Ravenscroft, found a member of the Eddie Grundy fan club. So what an honour that was to have people like that.
Were they both listeners to the Archers then?
Yeah,
presumably they were.
So.
Right.
Yeah, they were both listeners. And what John Walters said was, he said the first 100 members of the Eddie Grundy fan club he was going to invite to his house. I think it was the first 100 or the first 50, something like that. And that happened. Yeah, he invited all these people who joined up to have a party in his house. I mean, you know, what a brave thing to do. But, it was great. And one of the great things was, I say, Eddie, at the time, he used to wear this hat with horns. And John came up with this brilliant idea to have the society that we would meet. Because Eddie said a line once, which John Walters thought was hilarious, called, I'm chuffed as a bowl of badger fat, was an Eddie Grundy line. So he said, what we must do, because he's got horns, when you greet somebody who's in the fan club, you go, badger, like that, representing the horns. And their reply was, badge. And that was John Walters' idea. But it was fun. And we used to have once a year an Eddie up at the Bull in Inkborough, and people would come along, and I met some wonderful people. One of the members that came along was a lovely guy called Wild Willie Beckett. who was, I think, the shadow minister for the monster raving loony party at the time, or something like that. He was one of their shadow ministers. But it was just fun. It was just great. We just had a laugh and what have you. And they were a lovely bunch of people. You know, it was just crazy, I suppose, really, you know, in the early 80s like that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, 44 years, so much has changed in the storyline, but also I can imagine in the Archer's production as well, how it's rehearsed, produced, recorded. How has the process changed for you?
For me, well, before me, it was all done on discs in the early days, which of course would have been a nightmare for an actor because they would start at the very, very beginning. And that would be it. If you were in the last scene, you imagine if you were in the last scene and you fluffed, they would have to go not back to that scene, but go back to the beginning of the program again. So that would, unfortunately, that wasn't in my day. But when I joined, we were in mono. And I remember the excitement of when they decided they were going to go to stereo. So I think, yes, I was a mono radio actor when I first joined. But eventually the Archers were done in stereo and what have you. But yeah, a lot of things have changed. And of course, it always used to be tape. It was recorded on tape as everything was, if you tape recorders and things like that. And so even today in the studio, we've still got old tape, which is down on the floor, which sounds a bit like, hay, you're walking on hay or grass. Yeah, and I always say, that's some of my fluffs I'm walking on. But now it's all digital. I mean, it's incredible how things have moved. And in one way, I think I'm quite lucky to have been able to witness the progression of how the Archers has done technically. I'm not a technical person at all, but I admire the people who are on the programme.
And of course, it came to the fore during lockdown with many of the actors having to perform remotely. Of course, let's talk about Eddie and your views on Eddie, Trevor. If you, Trevor, lived in Ambridge, would you seek out Eddie Grundy for a pint in the Bull?
I couldn't escape him because I do enjoy a pint myself, so I would obviously be in the pub when Eddie's there. And I suppose because I'm not a very good DIY person, I'm one of those people I'd ask Eddie to sort of help me out, to sort of mend the odd fence. Or Eddie, can you come round and do a bit of work? So I would probably employ Eddie, on and off.
But would you seek him out for company, social company? I mean, basically, would you like him enough to have a pint with him?
Oh, I definitely have a pint with him. Yes, I think that I wouldn't like to go into business with him. I wouldn't get that far, but I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind buying him the odd pint and having a laugh. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in all of those years, Trevor, what moments really stand out to you? What are the big memories that you have?
Well, yeah, as I say, over 44 years, I've been very lucky being in the programme for that long, and there's been a lot of stories. What I like about it really is, as I was talking about the sort of crazy days of the fan club and all that. And when Eddie, I was 22 when I joined the programme, so I was almost a youth, I suppose. But things changed. He was a bit of a character then, of course he was. We all were, weren't we? But Eddie's older than me, but he's changed. A lot of things have happened in his life. He's not a two-dimensional character. He's had tragedies as well as comedies. And I suppose one of the biggest moments would have to be when we were evicted from Grange Farm, because, we had lived in Grange Farm, or the Grundys had lived in Grange Farm for years and years and years, and all of a sudden they were evicted. And I remember very much doing that actual episode. There were tears in my eyes when we were locking up Grange Farm. And the director at the time who directed that particular episode was Sean O'Connor. And I remember, I think he even came in with a bottle of wine afterwards, because it was a very emotional thing. And what happened from that, of course, they left Ambridge. They went into Borchester, living in Meadow Rise, and lots of stories there. And poor old Joe Grundy went AWOL and disappeared. And it was quite, it was really traumatic for them. And of course, I remember once going somewhere and a guy came up to me and said, by the way, so I know exactly what you're going through. I almost lost my farm and that. And it suddenly dawned on me. I thought, it's these kind of things happen in real life. So that was one of the occasions in the program that, I suppose, looking back on it now, was a really important and big event. And of course, it changed the Grundys, because, as I say, Eddie, I always say, oh, Eddie's a lovable rogue kind of thing. And to a certain extent, he has been in these years and still is. But to be able to go through and play drama as well has been a great privilege for me personally as an actor. And as I say, there have been many stories, but I've enjoyed the comic elements, and I've enjoyed his scams as well.
Yeah.
I mean, in your own words, only the other night, you said that Eddie's always involved in half-baked, get-rich-quick schemes.
Yeah.
But do you actually, after a while, wish... you said that you don't think Eddie is a two-dimensional character, but they do tend to lean heavily on his scams, don't they? Would you like to actually have even more scope for the character, have more of those emotionally charged scenes you just mentioned?
Yeah, I like both. I mean, I've been so fortunate playing Eddie, because I remember now looking back on things, as you're reminding me of so much. I mean, I've had big scenes with Eddie and Ed, when he went wrong and what have you, and of course the very sensitive moments with William, when he had the shotgun, of course, and that was another very sensitive moment. And personally, to me, was losing Edward Kelsey, who played Joe. Ted was a great friend of mine, and obviously I was very upset when Ted passed away. But I also had to do it as Eddie, who discovered Joe, and that was a very, personal moment. And I saw Ted there, and so that was. I'm glad I did it, and what I think about, which I think the writers and Jeremy, they sent Joe Grundy off in a wonderful way. He even had a storyline after he'd passed away, and I think that was very clever and great. And even, I think there was one episode which finished, and you heard him talk about cider, and Joe's voice came in the sing tune at some point, and I thought that was lovely. It really was a great tribute to a lovely man. But yeah, going back to the other things, I mean, I've had some great scams with Joe. Eddie and Joe had some great scams together. And Ted and I used to work together in a lot of the agricultural shows, where we would be Joe and Eddie on stage. And it was great. It was a great relationship. So yeah, I think I'm very lucky to be able to be given the opportunity to play the tragedy, but also to do the comedy and the scams. I love those as well, equally.
Because, I mean, you effectively, when Joe died, were given almost the entire episode to yourself, weren't you? That must have been a very poignant episode to have essentially all Eddie's, really.
Yeah, I remember, yes. I mean it's so lovely that Joe died peacefully. Of course, he left the cider shed and went off, and of course, then Eddie discovered him. And yes, it was quite a long speech I had as Eddie talking to Joe, and I remember it was the lovely spot effects person we've got, Nessie. I remember her coming up, because I was looking at basically this sort of sofa kind of bed, and said, "Do you want me here or not, or do you want me to rush?" And they were so sensitive about it. And I think I didn't do many takes. I think I wanted to get it right first time. I think I did possibly go back and do other little bits again, but it was, I felt emotional, and the writer had written it beautifully. And yeah, it was a moment for me to pay tribute to Ted as Eddie, and that was a great thing, because he was a lovely man. I think a lot of your viewers and listeners probably miss Joe. He was such a lovely character.
Yes, it was that relationship between Joe and Eddie, and again some of the schemings but the kindness and care that they had for each other. And I'm interested in that, because you've got this whole family Eddie Grundy has, but do they feel like your family as well? Because you've got Will and Ed and the grandkids, and how much are those actors family to you?
They are very much. It's. I know it's one of those people thinks, oh, the Archers is one big happy family. And it is, I can't really pretend it isn't, because we don't work with each other every single day. We go in to record our episodes, whatever, and we catch up with people. Oh, how's so-and-so, has your son passed his A-levels and all that kind of thing. So that's a nice sort of atmosphere. But family-wise, yes. I mean, when my real father passed away to a certain extent. Ted became a little bit of my father, that was much so. Heather Bell, who plays Clary, was the original Clary all those years ago. She came back to play Clary. Ed, Barry, lovely Barry, I went to his wedding when he got married, and we do call each other that. I mean, sometimes Philip, who plays will come in, and I do say, right, son. So there is that kind of thing. If we send each other messages, like, happy birthday to my radio husband or something like that. So there is a little bit of family there, which is nice because, I can remember when William was born all those years ago, and he's grown up. The characters have grown up, and now of course Eddie's a grandfather, and with George and people. But it's just great, and it's nice to see new people come into the program as well.
Talking of poor Clary,
yes,
Trevor.
The long suffering.
A few days ago, I was actually quite concerned for Clary a few days ago, Trevor, because, as you know, she exclaimed that she was sick of her life and the way the Grundys always had to scrape by. In all the years in the show and all the scenes you've acted with Clary in, can you remember a more desperate Clary? I can't remember a more desperate one.
No, I suppose going back originally, as I said, when we were evicted, I suppose that was a big thing. And there has been lots of things happening. The thing is, what's happening at the moment, what Eddie Culler's realised, hold on a second, we're not getting any younger. We're renting Grange Farm and what have you. So, I can appreciate the Clary situation of what she's in. And, she is, as you say, she is sound desperate. And I suppose her Grundy men haven't really helped, I suppose, in that. But there again, they're panicking as well. Eddie's worried about what the future's going to be. But there again, I suppose he always has, really, But he's been lucky. He has had some very, very narrow escapes. I even remember him going to court about dodgy meat years ago.
Yes.
He's never done anything horribly wrong, but occasionally he's been borderline.
He's never poisoned the am.
No, exactly. He's
But you mentioned Clary. Going back, Clary wasn't the first romance for Eddie, was she, Trevor?
No, not indeed. When I joined the programme, Eddie was engaged to a character called Dolly Treadgold. And they were going to get married, and they were going to have the wedding reception in the turkey shed, as of course Eddie would save a few pennies. But eventually, no, they didn't get married. And I remember to this day asking Clary out. Eddie was up on the roof at Jethro's house, which of course Jethro Larkin was Clary Larkin's father, and Eddie asked her out, shouting down the chimney. He was up on the roof and he shouted down the chimney, "Oh, what are you doing tonight?" Or whatever the line was. I always remember it because in the studio I used a bucket, and I was shouting into a bucket, which of course gave the echo effect of the chimney. And that was a few years ago now, 40 something. But I still remember it to that day, asking Clary out, because when I went for the audition, I was actually told that what was going to happen. She said the idea is, because I think the editor was William Smethurst and Vanessa was the director, and she said, we want to have fun with Jethro's daughter Clary and Joe's son Eddie. That the idea was that they were going to get together, that there was going to be some kind of relationship. So when I went into the programme, I did know that when Clary was cast shortly after me, that something was going to develop between us. So I was aware of that. And one of the lovely things I like when Eddie and Clary eventually, because there was a bit of before he got married, he went off with Jolene Rogers, the Lily of Leighton Cross, because Eddie was into country and western and she was a country and western singer. They did a kind of mini tour together or what have you. And eventually Eddie came back and did marry Clary. And one of the things I used to love in those days was every time Eddie opened the door in Grange Farm, Clary's words were always, "Boots," because Eddie would always walk into the kitchen in muddy boots.
We need to talk about George as well, Trevor, because unlike Neil, his other grandfather, you seem to have a bit of a soft spot for George, and you seem to get on with him much better. We had Emerald on last week, who, as you know, plays Emma.
Yes, indeed.
She Emerald, not Emma, but she was talking on behalf of herself. She thinks that George is a psychopathic misogynist. Now, do you, Trevor, agree with her?
Do I agree with Emerald?
Yeah, you.
I think there's something inside. There's something ticking, isn't there? There's something which I think he has to be nurtured. And I mean, Eddie treats him as a buddy. Sitting there in the ball together and having a chat. Now, Eddie is very fond of George. I mean, because Eddie wasn't a saint in his early days. But I don't know. It'd be interesting to see how the relationship develops. When George first came into the program, I was really pleased because there was an element early on of the sort of Joe and Eddie relationship. And because obviously Eddie had lost Joe, when George came along, I think that became to be a bit more because he wasn't as sensible as the other two sons at that stage, kind of thing. And the character George, I think, is an interesting one. But the other day in one of the episodes, when again going back to Quentin's point, when Clary was getting all desperate and saying, "Look, I'm fed up with this," Eddie went out to see William and George to say, "Look, you've got to stop this. Clary means a lot to me, what have you." And to be fair to George, he did turn around and say, "Well, shall I go and apologise?" And Eddie said, "Oh, no, it's all right, But, George is a fascinating character. Right? No, I mean, what Emerald said, it's an interesting comment. But the thing is, the actor who plays George is such a lovely guy. But there again, that's acting, isn't it? It is. It's like people mention that Rob Titchener, the actor, lovely man,
But it sounds like you wouldn't go as far as Emerald in what you think about George.
Yeah, I suppose, to be honest with you, I suppose I haven't given it that much thought. I haven't looked to see I don't know what his future would be. He seems to me, I don't know, he seems to be settling down a bit. He seems, because he's getting different jobs now, isn't he? And going into different directions. I mean, I don't know. I do say that, he's a Grundy. Grundys never see exactly the, never are always, they're not saints. The Grundy men have never been saints. But I don't know. It's an interesting comment, whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just going to wait and see.
Yeah, that's true. Now, before we go on to the questions from Facebook, I just wonder, your voice, there's elements of Eddie, but it's not full Eddie. Can you just give us a line where you're in your full Eddie Grundy voice?
Well, many years ago, in those days, Eddie used to wear this hat with horns. And he sang a record once called Poor Pig. And one of the lines was, "They say that I'm no good, or they say I'm really mean. They say my head's a pair of horns with nothing in between." But that was many, many years ago, and he's grown up since then.
That's brilliant.
I found that out the other day because I knew I was talking to you. I thought, I'll bring that out of the wardrobe.
Yes, you've got a question about that, I think. It's fantastic. Well, yeah, let's go on to the questions that our Facebook group members have raised.
Well, I'm wondering if this actually just ties in with what Trevor's just done for us. This comes from Angie. She says, "Please ask Trevor if he owns Eddie's hat and if it's the original one from 44 years ago." So is that the hat she's talking about?
Yeah, actually, it isn't the original one. The original one was very, very heavy. They were very, very big horns. It was quite difficult to wear. So shortly after, we did a play I think it was around about 1985. We did this wonderful play at the Watermill Theatre near Newbury. And it was an artist production. And I said to the lovely wardrobe lady, I said, "Well, I've got this cowboy hat." I said, "But in the programme, Eddie wears this hat with horns." And she said, "Leave it with me." And she came back with that. So this is the 1985-ish version, and I've had it ever since. So that's the longest one. And I'm glad I kept it. I thought I'd lost it. And the other day I thought, look at how what's this? Oh, it's that with the horns.
Oh, that is brilliant.
That needs to go into the Radio Hall of Fame. That one does, Trevor.
The thing about that, though, in those days, is that being a radio program, that was actually visual, because it was based on a real person who was a country and western fan who did wear a hat with horns. He lived next door to the then editor, so Eddie was based on a real character for that particular thing, and of course it was visual. So every time I went out in those days, I had to wear the hat with horns. I don't now, and haven't for years.
Fantastic. The next question is from Andrea, who says, and this is a great question, are there real ferrets in the studio for their pivotal scenes, or do you get to hold one of Clary Love's knitted ferrets?
That's a sweet question. I have handled ferrets in the past. I mean, they're lovely looking creatures, but I'm afraid we don't have real ferrets in the studio. Now, the great thing about on the radio is two different things. We have lovely spot effect person. There's a lot of spot. There are literally our hands and feet, because we've got scripts, so sometimes we can't do certain things, and they make the sounds around us. But other things like cows and what have you are all sort of done on disc, sort of digitally, or whichever they are now these days, because cows do make a mess in the studio to get a lot of people at the same time. But animal-wise, no. Animals are always, the sound always comes into them. We don't actually handle them, but which in one way is good, because they it's very difficult. I mean, I remember once I was in this play, which I mentioned before, the Archers play at the Watermill Theatre, and Jack Woolley, a lovely character I used to really like, had this dog called Captain, and we had a real dog, and he got lost, and I rescued him, and every night I would come on with this dog, and there we are, Captain, oh, brilliant. And this one night I went one way, and the dog went the other, and I came on stage with an empty lead, and I said, I'm just taking your dog back home to Grey Gables, Jack. So no, I'm glad we don't work with animals in the studio.
I was genuinely delighted for Eddie that his ferret wheel actually worked at the fair. I thought, because it sounded like it was going to be a disaster, and it was actually a great success. So I
loved that storyline. It was a good one.
For once, his ferrets didn't lead to chaos. Right, we've got a question from Pam. And she wants to know, Trevor, why does it always have to take Clary teetering on the brink of a complete meltdown before Eddie wakes up to appreciate and recognise her value? In real life, do you think a woman like Clary would have stuck with a fella like Eddie? Why does she endure?
Yeah, interesting question, Pam. I don't know. They've had their lovely romantic moments. I remember once when there was a character, some of your viewers may remember, Jean-Paul, the French chef, and Clary had a big thing about France and French. And Eddie got really jealous and went off to these lavender fields. He actually came on singing a Sacha Distel song, I think, if I remember right. So yeah, Eddie does love Clary. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Like when I mentioned earlier about saying to William and George, look, Clary means a lot. You've got to look after her and what have you. He does love her. I think Clary does know that. But I suppose to a certain extent, I have to say, well, perhaps he's a bit stubborn sometimes. And yes, it does take Clary to turn around and say, look, snap out of it. This is reality. I think he gives in the end, though, Pam. He does give in to Clary in the end. He does see the light.
Clary loves him as well. Essentially, presumably.
Oh yeah, it is a very good relationship. I mean, don't forget, it's only been fairly recently where they renewed their wedding vows.
Oh yeah.
I mean, so that said something, I think, for the couple.
Well, the next question is from Pat, who says, as a relative newcomer to listening, circa 2017, I'd like to hear how Trevor feels Eddie has changed over the years, or if he's exactly the same. It's a bit of what we've already talked about, Trevor. And Eddie is usually a comic character, but Trevor has also played some very touching scenes. Which has Trevor found most moving?
Oh, yeah. I think what I mentioned before, I think the most moving must have been when Eddie found Joe, because that was very emotional. And it was basically what happened after a real event. The Archers and its lovely listeners lost Ted, as well as Joe, who played him. Of course, when I mentioned about the eviction, that was a big story. But of course, it was It is fictitious, and we knew that we were going to Borchester. We weren't going to disappear from Ambridge totally. We did eventually come back. But I think perhaps probably the most moving, I think, was that finding Eddie finding Joe, because it was after a real event, and I then at the time was still emotional about it. So I think that was probably it.
Okay. We've got one from Rosemary now, Trevor. And she says, Eddie can be absolutely wonderful, such as when Nick was dying and he was lambing at Brookfield. Calm, efficient, caring, everything good. Why does he keep that side hidden?
Oh, Rosemary, what an interesting question. Well, I'm glad you spotted it. Yeah, there is something I think quite nice about Eddie deep down. He has got an emotional side. Now, I say that selfishly because I'm a Piscean and Eddie's a Piscean. We're both Piscean. And I think people say Pisceans can be a bit sensitive. And I think Eddie is. And Rosemary's right. Yeah, I can, looking back on it, over the years, there have been moments when people have shone away from certain things. But Eddie's been the one who said, no, this is, this is right. We must carry on. There's nothing wrong with this. And so, yeah, he has got a sensitive side. But you say, Rosemary's interesting question. Why does he keep it hidden? I think it's because he's still the sort of farming type, isn't he? And get on with things and what have you. So he's still got that very side to him like that. But yes, Rosemary, you're right, and it's nice that you've spotted that Eddie can be quite sensitive in certain situations.
Very good. Well, the next question is from Callisto, who's picking up on the romance that we mentioned earlier. Did Eddie fancy Jolene? Perhaps he wasn't her type.
That's very interesting. It's one of those things. I mean, the writers might know better than me, but it's been one of those things over the years whereby whenever the lovely Buffy Davis would come in and play Jolene in those early days, it was always sort of, looking out for Eddie and all that, because they did have a relationship of sorts. It's never, ever been mentioned that they had any other, it's always been a friendship. So it's one of those sort of mysteries. I find it quite fascinating, and I think there's some lovely things, like people who listened to the Archers over many years. There was a lovely character called Nelson Gabriel, and people there were certain things about, did Nelson do this or didn't he? And so to a certain extent, perhaps it may have been said in an episode I wasn't in, but I've never actually, to the best of my knowledge, said Eddie has never turned around. Well, actually, all those years ago, Jolene Rogers and I were more than friends. That's never happened. So perhaps they weren't at all. But of course they were mad into country and western music, and I have sang with Buffy, as Jolene and Eddie on the program, and that's been great to do things like that. And so I think there's always been a twinkle between Jolene and Eddie, even though now she's happily with Kenton and all that. There's always been a sort of twinkle thing, as there has also been with Lillian and Eddie, because Lillian and Eddie have known each other since they were at school, since they were children. And although Lillian's a total different character, there's always been a sort of little bit of a bond between the two characters, because they go back a long time.
Well, at least you were spared the infamous shower scene, weren't you, with Jolene, Trevor?
Yes, I don't think I've ever done a shower scene as Eddie.
Right, our final question, Trevor, comes from Rachel. And she says, I'd like to know if he ever cringes at Eddie's inane money-making schemes. And if so, which was the worst?
Oh, dear. I don't think I've ever cringed because it's Eddie, he's up to anything. I remember once he tried to start a maggot farm, which didn't go down too well in the village. I mean, there's been so many scams over the years and what have you. I think that the recent one, up to date, I suppose, must be the silent fireworks. That weren't actually silent, were they, really? They're quite loud, if I remember. But, I don't know, it's interesting. Have I ever cringed about them? I don't think I have. Perhaps I'm getting a bit like Eddie. But I just think it's fun to do his scams, and I think people know him by now, that when he starts talking about, something's coming up, He's up.
Yeah.
He's up to something.
We,
But I don't think. Yeah, as you said, Quinton, about the rich quick schemes. I once said to one of the bosses years ago, I said, "Wouldn't it be nice if Eddie, did something really good and won something and had lots of money and all of that?" He said, "No, it wouldn't be Eddie then, would it?" I think that Eddie's, I don't know, perhaps he's destined to be a failure. I don't know, but what they've got in store for him. But I enjoy playing them. It is fun, and as I said to you, and I've said it a couple of times, I do apologise for repeating myself, but I'm so lucky to be able to play both, to play the comedy into the scams, and also to have the sensitive, tragic moments from time to time. So I regard myself as being lucky to be able to do that.
Well, we're lucky to listen to you, Trevor, but we come to the very final question, which is one from Emma Grundy, that we interviewed last week. Each week we ask the person we're interviewing a question to ask the person next week. And Emma wanted us to ask you this. What do you think Eddie's ultimate ambition is now? Has it changed over the years?
Oh, that's a good one. Yes, I think his ambition has changed over the years. I mean, I suppose his ambition, as Quintin pointed out earlier on, was to get rich quick. I think now his ambition will be to have a nice, comfortable dotage, with all the sort of things that's good. I think he's happy to be comfortable now and not worry too much, I think, rather than get rich quick. I mean, I don't know. Good question, Emma. But I think the answer is Eddie has changed his ambitions, in my personal views.
Well, Trevor, it's just been wonderful to talk to you and hear more about Eddie. We're so very grateful for your time. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, both.